The Zarseth Vow drifted in high orbit over Althera Prime's ruins, its hull casting a long, ominous shadow across the splintered remains of the moon. Thousands of lights blinked across the vessel's surface, a constellation of sensors, scanning arrays, and weapon systems humming with unspent violence. Inside, the main command deck buzzed with urgency, ambition, and the high-pitched warble of 12 different languages overlapping in open comms. General Yalixa stood at the forefront, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Her long, dark blue coat shimmered faintly, programmed to adjust its opacity based on her emotional state. Right now, it was almost opaque black. Bad sign. Her long ears, distinctive among the Arvan Yi, twitched with restrained annoyance. She listened as Commander Kelvar, a blob-like diplomat from the Denzari conflux, attempted to explain the current tactical stance using a series of wet squelches and holographic gestures that looked, to her, suspiciously like a recipe for soup. To summarize, she cut in, slicing across languages like a blade through silk. Our esteemed friend suggests we attempt coordinated beam saturation at the anomaly's core, which, if we're lucky, might delay its self-replication by a few hours. Kelvar burbled in agreement. Yalixa sighed and turned away from the projected image of the threat. It hung in the center of the chamber, like a fever dream, an amorphous biomechanical mass with fractal appendages, absorbing matter from orbit and warping it into twisted geometries. The Carnix, artificial, ancient, angry. It had already consumed 3 minor moons and 1 very unlucky mining station. Now it was chewing its way through the debris field like a cosmic goat. And still, the human just stood there. He was leaned up against a support strut, arms folded, one foot resting lazily over the other. His armor looked half forgotten, matte gray, scuffed in places that suggested routine maintenance had been replaced by vague shrugs. His helmet hung at his belt, and in his right hand was a small stained thermos. Steam rose gently from the top. Yalixa stared. The other commanders whispered in their respective dialects. The Deltari flared their gill membranes in disbelief. The Treen clicked their beaks. Even the Hulnari, who believed in silent stoicism to the point of communication through passive-aggressive breathing, emitted a noise that sounded suspiciously like laughter. "Are we sure that's the human?" someone murmured in Yalix's ear. "He introduced himself as David Grant," she replied, deadpan. "He came alone, carrying a suitcase with 3 tools, a portable heater, and a copy of something called Midnight Mechs, Director's Cut. He also asked where the closest lavatory was and whether the coffee on board had actual caffeine or just diplomacy juice." The laughter was less muffled this time. David, for his part, took a sip and looked up mildly. "Anyone need a hug?" he asked cheerfully. "No? Just me? All right then." Yalixa turned away before she smiled. It was infuriating. "Human," she said coolly. "Do you understand the stakes of the operation?" David nodded. "Yup. Do you have any concrete input to add to the current discussion?" He glanced at the projection of the Carnix, considered for a moment, then said, "Has anyone tried unplugging it and plugging it back in?" The Denzari dissolved into squelchy chuckles. Yalixa's expression didn't change, but one of her eyelids twitched. "This is not a joke," she snapped. David sighed. "It never is, General. That's the problem." Before she could respond, a new alarm lit up the deck. Pulsing crimson lines ran along the walls, and a dozen data displays exploded with motion. The Carnix had accelerated, its tendrils flaring as it pulsed energy through a gravitational lance. A scout ship, Intrepid Horizon, was instantly vaporized, its last transmission caught in a loop. "I think it sees us. Wait, is that an eye or a—" The feed cut out. The room exploded into chaos. Commands flew. Translations lagged. The Treen scrambled fighter support, while the Deltari attempted to establish a signal barrier. Yalixa issued orders in clipped, perfect bursts, trying to herd chaos into strategy. In the middle of it all, David set his thermos down carefully on a terminal, stretched once, and cracked his neck. The motion was wrong. Yalixa noticed it instantly. It wasn't lazy. It wasn't bored. It was precise, practiced, like a dancer stretching before a battle ballet. The armor shifted on his frame, realigning with small mechanical clicks, as though it had been waiting for him to mean it. A low hum began to rise from his belt, the kind of frequency that made sensitive equipment hiccup. He tapped his wrist. A map unfolded midair, a simplified outline of the Carnix. He studied it in silence. Yalixa approached, drawn in despite herself. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked. "Looking for a way in." "In? Into that?" She gestured to the nightmare coiling on the hologram. "It's a planet-sized AI tumor with a death wish and a gravity well." David smiled faintly. "Sounds like a Monday." "Human, you have no authorization to—" He looked at her, not disrespectfully, not mockingly, but like someone who had already done the math and come to terms with the cost. "You brought me to stand here. You hoped I wouldn't have to do anything. I get it, but you saw what it just did. We don't have time for another committee debate." She didn't respond. Her mind raced. Who was this man? Earth's champion? She'd expected augmentation, mutation, a walking bomb perhaps. Not this. "Why do you even want to go in there?" she asked softly. David looked back at the image. The Carnix twisted in silence, its form pulsing like a heartbeat across the void. "Because someone has to," he said simply, "and because nobody ever believes it's going to be the guy with the coffee." He walked toward the launch bay. Alarms howled. The commanders barked for security to stop him, but no one moved fast enough. Within seconds, he was gone, slid into an old Earth-designed pod that looked like it had survived more arguments than wars. Its engine flared. It dropped from the Zarsith vow like a stone from heaven. Yalixa stood frozen. Someone beside her said, almost reverently, "He's going to die." Yalixa watched the trail streaking across the dark. "No," she said quietly. "He's going to make us all very uncomfortable first." And for the first time in days, she smiled. The drop pod hurtled through the void like a tin can hurled by a wrathful deity. Inside, David Grant sat cross-legged, eyes half closed, arms folded across his chest like he was meditating in a sauna built by delinquent engineers. The pod shook with alarming irregularity. Earth tech, by tradition, never quite believed in smooth rides. He opened one eye to glance at the flickering control screen. The targeting reticule was struggling to maintain lock on the Carnix. It kept glitching out, labeling the colossal creature unknown hostile entity, then extreme hazard, then inexplicably do not pet. "Good advice," David muttered, thumbing the display until it stopped flashing. "No belly rubs for the galaxy-devouring void beast." "Got it." Outside, the stars bent around the immense gravitational pull of the Carnix. It had grown larger, not in a visible way, but perceptually, like a looming nightmare pressing against the walls of reality. Its surface churned with shifting geometry, spires of metal and fluid intelligence rising and falling with pulsing rhythm. It didn't move so much as rearrange itself, like a cosmic puzzle board with its own configuration. Inside the Zarsith vow, the command bridge was grim. The Alliance commanders had fallen into a stunned silence, their elaborate ornamentation and posturing deflating under the weight of what they'd just witnessed. "He launched himself," a Trine ambassador whispered, voice clicking in disbelief. "He just launched himself." "Without permission," added a Deltari aide. "Without backup," growled a Hulnari tactician. "Without pants," added a small voice. Heads turned. A junior analyst blushed. "I mean, metaphorically without pants. Just so unprotected." Yalixa stood at the center of it all, arms still crossed. Her long ears twitched in small arcs, betraying thought spirals. She watched the red trail of David's pod streak toward the Carnix on the external monitor, then finally said, "Get me a live feed from his suit." "Is that even legal?" "Nothing about this is legal anymore." After a few seconds of static, a helmet cam flickered to life. The feed stabilized, revealing David's face as he took a long sip from a backup thermos he'd somehow brought along. He raised it slightly toward the camera. "To whomever's watching," he said, "hello from the worst Uber ride of my life." Yalixa's lips twitched. She refused to smile. Absolutely refused. Back inside the pod, proximity alarms screamed. The Carnix had noticed the intruder. Tendrils unfolded from its outer shell, forming fractal limbs that shimmered with programmable matter. One swept toward the pod like a scythe made of thought. David calmly pulled a lever. With a groan that suggested years of skipped maintenance checks, the pod separated into 5 pieces, dispersing like startled pigeons. His seat rocketed free, the rudimentary thrusters on his suit engaging. David shot forward, twisting between chunks of failed delivery drone shielding and shrapnel from some unfortunate pirate vessel. A thin field of blue shimmered around him, a kinetic dispersal net cobbled together from scavenged Arvin Yi tech and what looked suspiciously like duct tape. Approaching the meat of the sandwich, he muttered as the outer shell of the Carnix grew impossibly close. Then it opened. There was no door, no port, just a yielding of the material, as if the thing were more aware than architecture. The surface bubbled, swirled, and parted, forming a tunnel lined with metallic fibers and glowing nerve threads. The moment he crossed into it, sound died. No more comm chatter, no alarms, just a silence that seemed to hum with curiosity. "Gross," David muttered, floating down the corridor. "I've seen cleaner bio-hallways in a diseased Groknari colonship." Yalixa, watching the feed, leaned in unconsciously. The Carnix's interior was a nightmare of logic. Walls shifted in response to David's movement. Symbols flickered in and out of view, some that resembled language, others that looked like memories. A disassembled star drive pulsed like a heart in the distance. The further David ventured, the more the architecture adapted, almost as if it were trying to learn him. Then it tried to speak. A voice, not a sound, but a presence, pushed against his consciousness. "You are anomalous, undefined, incompatible." "Yeah, I get that a lot," David replied. "State function. Wouldn't you like to know?" "State function," he sighed. "Fine. Human. Designated guardian of Earth. Currently unauthorized burr in your big ol' metal butt. Threat level, insignificant." David's eyes twinkled. That's what they said about fire ants. Without warning, the corridor snapped shut behind him, the wall stiffening. A sharp noise, like metal screaming underwater, rattled through his skull. Tendrils launched from the walls, aiming to bind him. David was already moving. He twisted, yanked a small cylindrical object from his belt, a repurposed magnetic pulse mine. It was ancient, ugly, and hummed with unstable charge. He slapped it to the nearest wall and kicked off. The blast sent tendrils writhing. The floor destabilized. He landed in a crouch, rolled under a shifting blade, and pulled another object from his belt. A strange, lumpy firearm patched together with pieces of alien tech and Earth hand-me-downs. It coughed once and fired a bolt of something. The beam struck the wall. It didn't explode. It unmade. The structure faded, disassembled at a quantum level, and replaced with empty space. Back on the bridge, silence reigned. "Did he just delete part of the ship?" someone asked. Yalixa stared at the screen. "Number. He erased it from continuity. That's not a weapon, it's a rewriter." The voice of the Carnix returned, slower now. "Correction. Threat level. Re-evaluating." David grinned. "Good. Keep doing that." He plunged deeper, moving like a man who'd walked through worse. The corridors tried tricks. Loops in time, rooms that echoed his own thoughts, projections of people he'd lost. He ignored them all, kept walking. At one point, a holographic version of his 4th-grade teacher scolded him for eating glue. "You again," he muttered and kept moving. He reached what passed for a central node, an enormous chamber filled with liquid data, swirling with stolen energy. At the core, a single sphere hovered, covered in code so dense it looked alive. David approached, tossed the thermos one last time for luck, and pulled a final device from his back. It wasn't sleek. It looked homemade, temperamental, probably illegal in 17 systems. He attached it to the sphere with a grunt. "You're going to want to back up now," he muttered to the camera. "Or forward. Time's weird in here." And then he pressed the button. The device pulsed once, then again, stronger, and then it began to sing. It wasn't a sound in the conventional sense. The sphere at the heart of the Carnix sang through gravitational murmurs, quantum vibrations and flickers in the EM field that tickled the back of David's molars. The chamber lit up like a star giving its last breath. Streams of living code cascaded down from the ceiling, curling around the device he'd planted. His own cobbled-together marvel, an ancient Terran interface hacked together with pieces of Arvin Yi memory crystals, a repurposed Holnari entropy inverter, and, crucially, a cheap coffee warmer. On the Zarsith Vow, the command crew stared in open astonishment. "What is that thing doing?" Atrine shrieked, clacking in panic. "Translating," Yalixa murmured, her ears twitching toward the image. "He's forcing it to hear him." Inside the Carnix, the atmosphere rippled. Tendrils that had previously attacked now paused, twitching midair like cobras faced with a flute. The entire internal structure of the ancient weapon flickered, an architecture of destruction suddenly uncertain. David stepped back, eyes locked on the node. He could feel it now, not just its power, but its purpose. It hadn't been built to destroy. Not originally. It had been a question cast into the void, a probe seeking understanding. Somewhere along the way, left to drift and reconfigure over millennia, it had misunderstood the response. He took a deep breath, lifting his voice. "Okay, you big misunderstood overachiever. I get it. You woke up, looked around, and decided everything was broken. So you started cleaning house, and by house I mean moons, and by cleaning I mean obliterating." The sphere responded with a low thrum, questioning. David nodded. "But here's the thing. We're all broken, especially us. We yell too loud, vote for the wrong leaders, and build weapons that make zero ethical sense. But we also play music. We tell stories. We try. Sometimes we even apologize." The energy in the room shifted, curious. "So I'm offering you something better than conquest. You don't need to keep rewriting the universe until it's silent. You just need to listen." From within his suit, David retrieved the last item he'd brought, a small, ancient MP3 player, encased in scratched plastic, duct taped twice over. He plugged it into the interface port, bypassed 3 layers of alien firewalls, and hit play. A song began to echo through the chamber. Bluesy, ragged, human. A gravel-voiced singer crooned about heartbreak and hope. The Carnix twitched again, as if trying to comprehend sorrow expressed in chords. Then, it began to change. All across its massive surface, the monstrous fractal limbs withdrew. The gravitational spikes dissolved. Ships long lost in its orbit were carefully released like puzzle pieces, gently returned to the table. On the Zarsith Vow, alarms stopped blaring. The crew gasped as the entity ceased its aggressive expansion and instead began to fold inwards, its outer shells reconfiguring not into weapons, but into something peaceful, something new. A moment later, David's helmet feed crackled. "Human," came Yalixa's voice, cool and cutting even through static. "What exactly did you do?" David wiped sweat from his brow and grinned at the floating sphere. "I made a friend." The chamber responded with a ripple of lights, a kind of laughter perhaps in the language of machines. The interface detached itself, and the MP3 player floated back into his hand. The voice of the Carnix returned, softer now. Function reevaluated. Hostile protocol disabled, awaiting further input. David raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me what to do next?" Request, purpose. He looked around the now tranquil chamber, then slowly turned to the exit, which opened willingly before him. "Learn," he said. "Observe. Maybe find a hobby that doesn't involve digesting planets. I recommend jazz. Or painting ducks." Understood. He floated out, the corridors now guiding rather than resisting. When he exited the Carnix, his suit registered no hostility, no gravity interference. Just the quiet hum of peace reclaimed. The drop pod reassembled around him as he drifted clear, magnetics engaging with a grunt and a buzz. David collapsed into the pilot's chair and cracked open the emergency ration bar stored behind his seat. It tasted like sawdust and resignation. "Good to be home," he muttered. When he docked aboard the Zarseth Vow, the hangar was unusually full. Diplomats, engineers, warriors, all present. Yalixa stood at the forefront, arms crossed, ears tilted forward. A hush fell as David stepped onto the deck, thermos back in hand, suit lightly steaming. No one spoke. He looked around, blinked, then said, "Is it customary to stare at someone like they just kissed a black hole?" Yalixa blinked slowly. "You calmed the Karniks with music and a coffee warmer." He shrugged. It was more of a vibe shift. Silence stretched. Then someone laughed, a Denzari wheezing wetly. The sound spread like wildfire until the hangar was ringing with laughter. Even the Hulnari released a breathy snort. Yalixa did not laugh, but she did step forward, studying him. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I first saw you, I thought Earth had sent a decoy." David smiled. "That's fair. I thought you were going to interrogate me in a meat locker. I still might." A pause. "Drinks first?" he offered. She tilted her head, almost smiling. "Perhaps." Later, after the debriefings, after the endless rounds of questions and the reluctant official commendations, David found himself alone on the observation deck. The Karniks floated in the distance, now inert, its form changing, something between cathedral and cradle. He took a sip from his thermos. It had finally run dry. He'd left Earth a mystery to most of the galaxy. Now he was a myth. But David Grant didn't feel mythical. He felt tired. His muscles ached. His fingers were stained with coolant. His brain still echoed with the weight of alien thought. And yet, he smiled. He had done something no weapon could achieve. He hadn't fought harder. He'd listened better. Maybe that was Earth's real strength. The doors behind him slid open. Yalixa entered, still in uniform, a second thermos in her hand. She handed it to him without a word. Their fingers brushed. He raised it in salute. "To unlikely guardians," he said. "To improbable victories," she replied. And together, they watched as the stars realigned themselves around a quiet, curious machine that no longer wished to be feared.